towards the end. So please submit your questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. This debate series was designed to enrich the public policy negotiations of our greater Boston communities by engaging the region's scholars, policymakers, and community leaders in dynamic conversations on the critical issues of today, really to provide space for productive, deep, and possibly messy dialogues about how to affect change on issues such as criminal justice reform, transportation, housing, education, and more. Today, we'll be discussing whether free public transit can and should be implemented, both generally as a policy model and specifically within the greater Boston region. We've been choosing debate topics for this series based upon what is most relevant to our communities today. And the free transit movement is gaining momentum from LA to Kansas City to Worcester right here at home. And in the historical mayoral race underway in the city of Boston, nearly every candidate in the 6-person field has expressed support for some form of fare elimination on the MBTA. So, given the focus and relevance of this topic, we look forward to a thoughtful and challenging conversation on the question of can and should public transit be free? And to guide this conversation, we are honored to have Monica Tibbits-Nutt with us as the moderator. Monica is the executive director of the 128 Business Council, where she advises communities in the 128 corridor on transit planning and oversees the operation of 12 shuttle routes with nearly 500,000 annual riders, a leading model for suburban transportation. Among her many board appointments and volunteer efforts, including serving as a mentor to our Rappaport Summer Fellows, Monica serves on the Massachusetts Department of Transportation Board of Directors, and until very recently was the vice chair of the Fiscal Management and Control Board that did oversee the MBTA for the last 6 years. I have been lucky enough to know Monica for almost a decade now, and she is consistently one of the most thoughtful and passionate voices in the space, and believes strongly in using her platform to educate the public about all aspects of transportation policy and the planning process. And so we are so excited that she'll be leading this conversation today. So Monica, thank you for joining us. I'll hand things over to you to introduce our debaters, David and Stacy, and kick things off.
Thank you for having me. I am glad that I'm not part of this debate because this is such an incredibly difficult question. So, since I am lucky not to be part of it, we brought in national and local experts. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them now. David Bragdon has been at the helm of TransitCenter since 2013, leading a New York City-based civic foundation dedicated to improving public transportation to make cities more just, sustainable, and prosperous. TransitCenter conducts applied research and supports community-based advocacy. David spent the early part of his career in the maritime and aviation freight industries. During 2002 to 2010, he was also elected to 2 terms as the president of the Metro Council, the regional government for the Portland, Oregon area. He served as director of New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability from 2010 to 2012. Transportation is a passion and vocation for David. He drove a taxi cab for a year, has jump-seated a 747 freighter into a remote airport in far eastern steppes of the then USSR, rode a Dutch container ship up the Strait of Malacca, and twice, once for 5 minutes in Minnesota and once for 10 minutes in Iowa, has been allowed to run the engineer's throttle on freight trains. He likes to move big things and clearly lives a much more exciting life than I do. We also have Stacy Thompson. Stacy is the executive director of LivableStreets, overseeing all programs including Vision Zero, Better Buses, and the Emerald Network, and ensuring overall programmatic and operational excellence for the organization. A relentless optimist, Stacy is undaunted by the many challenges facing Metro Boston today, including increasing access to jobs and affordable housing, improving safety and public health outcomes, and building climate change resiliency. Stacy believes that improving our streets isn't simply a transportation issue, but one of justice, equity, and opportunity. Previously, Stacy served as the Director of Events and Sponsorship at Ceres, a sustainability nonprofit organization, where she developed the strategic focus, content, and communications for major events. She also worked for the Office for Peace and Justice at the Archdiocese of Chicago, where she collaborated with community partners to organize educational forums and supported a broad array of social justice initiatives. She has a Master's of Arts in Social Justice from Loyola University and a Bachelor of Arts in Religious Education from St. Vincent College. Thank you both for being here today. So the way we're going to do this is we are going to have each panelist make their argument. At the conclusion of that, I will kick it off with a couple of different questions, and then we'll move to the public Q&A. So David, if you could please kick us off.
Great, thanks, Monica. Hey, Stacy, good to see you. So I'm going to answer a much more specific question. Transit people have got to really deal with the nuts and bolts. So the specific question, and then I'm going to pose a bigger question. The specific question than the one we've been asked. The specific question is, what can and should society do to help low-income people for whom the price of a transit ticket is an obstacle to access? There's a really straightforward, practical answer to that question. And it's similar to what we do with other public utilities in our society. They're generally funded by user fees, whether it's electric bills, water bills, or for that matter, food, a human right, where we have a SNAP program, or for example, housing, where we have vouchers. The answer is that society at large should provide funds for targeted, means-tested discounts as part of societal poverty alleviation program. And there are cities around the country and around the world that have models of how to do that effectively without stigma and efficiently to deliver that to people who need it. Well, now I'm going to ask the bigger question, the question that we really ought to be grappling with here. And this is not a question for me or any kind of real so-called expert. It's for somebody more important than Monica or Governor Baker. Let's call the person I'm going to ask this question, let's call her Nancy Wilkins. She lives kind of in the Dudley Square area, Washington Park Mall area around Roxbury. And she works at the Newton Wellesley Hospital. She starts, some days she has to start early. She's one of those people who well, I guess in Boston you would say outbound. In the rest of the world, we would use the word westbound, but whatever. She's going in the opposite direction of the traditional. And there are times she has to be there at 6 in the morning. There's times she's getting off at 11:30 p.m. on a Sunday night. And the question I'm going to ask her, Nancy, of all the things that we should be doing, that we need to do to make your life better with transit, what would be the biggest thing we could do? What are the most important things we can do to make a positive difference for you, Nancy? Well, let me tell you how she lives right now. She, of course, the Woodland stop of the D branch of the Green Line's right outside the hospital. So far, so good. But to get home, especially late at night, well, she could take that to Mass Ave and then change to the notorious, beloved by some, #1 bus on Mass Ave. Ayanna Pressley wrote it to Congress, great member of Congress, great television ad, terrible bus in terms of speed. Nancy would then have to change to the bus 23, might take her an hour and 10 minutes on a good day. She doesn't want to deal with the #1 and all its erraticism. She could get off elsewhere. She could catch the number 43. That runs every half hour. She might end up waiting 29 minutes for that. That may get her home in an hour and 25 minutes. She doesn't want to deal with the buses at all. She could ride the Green Line all the way into Park Street, way out of her way, and then come back on the Orange Line. Well, that's, an hour and 25, 135 minutes. Well, so she's paying $90 a month for that. Actually, the biggest thing she is paying is her time. Laurel Padgett-Seekins, formerly the MPTA, makes that point. The unrealized costs of our time that we're spending because our transit system is so inefficient. So let me just add too, Nancy could make that trip for 23 minutes in a car. So if I asked her that question, what are the things that are most important for us to do? She would say, I can guarantee you, based on surveys we have done of thousands of transit riders in cities across the country, what she would say is what it's most important for us to do for transit is more transit, more frequency, faster, more reliability, less crowded, safer, so not being harassed by people, better shelters, more hours of the day. Those are the things that she would be asking for if she's like the overwhelming majority of transit riders of all incomes. And our surveys consistently show that riders rank service quality and quantity over the fare price. And that's true at various levels of income. So what we ought to be doing is focusing on giving her the things that are most important to her and that she is asking for, that rather than something that's far down the list. Now, the fact is that all of those things that she is asking for and deserves All of those things cost money for a transit agency to provide, just like electric bills to Eversource provides for them to be able to run wires and generate electricity. Transit fares go to provide infrastructure and service in every large city in the country and in the world. In New York, it's 50% of the revenue comes from fares, Chicago 40%, BART in San Francisco 62%. Now, if you tell a transit agency you're going to take that revenue away, I can guarantee there is one thing that they can do with that revenue is taken away. They will cut service, because that is just the math of it. They will cut service. If you're running the CTA and somebody says we're going to take away 40% of your revenue, you can't afford it. You don't have the luxury of hoping that maybe after 80 years, the Illinois legislature is somehow going to change its heart and start funding transit adequately. They haven't been doing it before. So hiring and retaining drivers, a key imperative. That's what this money goes for. Well, what happens for Nancy when you cut that service? Well, remember the car trip that was so tempting for 23 minutes? She's already tempted. Well, if the service gets bad enough, she's going to do that. Rather than paying $90 a month for her unlimited pass, 12 months a year, $1,080. Now she's going to be saddled with $8,800 to $12,000 a year payments on a car. Not very good for her pocketbook, not very good for the environment, not good for the budget. In fact, the insurance on the car may be more than she's currently paying. So she'll be picking a more expensive option than the one that she currently has. That's not good. I'm here to say we need to focus really on giving Nancy and hundreds of thousands of riders the top things they are asking for. They're asking for more transit frequency, reliability, and better transit, rather than giving them something that they aren't necessarily asking for that will actually make it harder to provide the things that they actually are asking for. Back to you, Monica.
Thank you, David. Stacy?
Thank you. I'm so glad you brought back the #1 bus, because yesterday in the pouring rain, I was waiting in line to get on the bus. And someone tried to pay and the little card reader wasn't working. And the way that the bus driver sped it all up was just saying, get on, don't worry about paying. That just happened to me yesterday. And I think it's indicative of a lot of experiences folks have in Massachusetts. But so I want to start by doing something similar to what David said. And, you know, the question we were asked is, can and should transit be free? And this always seems like a strange question to me, because we already have free transit and we know it works. So when we look at Lawrence, when we look at Worcester, when we look at Kansas City, these are cities that have recently experimented with free transit within the last couple of years. And those experiments have been successful enough that those communities are doing everything they can to keep that free transit going. So they've tested the concept, right? We don't have to talk in hypotheticals. We can look at the examples that are happening in real time in this country to see what's working and what's not. So to me, the real question is, why, when we know that there are occasions where free transit works, are we so beholden to an outdated model of fare collection that isn't actually making transit service better? I don't actually disagree at all that we need to expand and improve service. Expanding and improving service will demonstrably bring more people to transit. That is unquestioned. However, I also don't think that there's a single transit system in this country that is running truly exceptional, reliable, fantastic service. If you found one, please send it my way. Crappy service, that is a technical term, is a pre-existing condition of our transit systems, and free fares have not caused that crappy service. I'm actually willing to posit that our over-reliance on fare collection to pay for transit has contributed to this crappy service in certain circumstances and created a scarcity mindset that we must continue to charge more and more and more for fares, while we watch our systems crumble from decades of disinvestment because we rely on an unstable, unreliable, and unequitable revenue source to move our transportation systems. We know fares alone will never pay for the transit system we need, so why are we beholden to this outdated funding model? It's cumbersome, it's expensive, it's inequitable. So my pitch on free transit is rooted in data and examples. I believe in free transit because free transit can increase ridership. Kansas City and Worcester, who offered free service throughout the duration of the pandemic, both demonstrated much more resilient ridership than their peer transit systems of similar size and demographics. In Lawrence, ridership rose by 25.6% in the first 6 months of their free fare transit program. Those aren't guesses, that's just how people reacted to free service without improving the service. Not saying we don't need to improve the service, just saying we know people will get on that service. Free transit can improve service quality. All-door boarding has been proven to help buses move faster and more reliably. In 2017, the MBTA conducted an all-door boarding pilot. The way they did that was by simply not collecting fares for a few weeks, and dwell time improved by 30%. Free transit can remove cost barriers for low-income individuals and remove the cumbersome administrative burden that often accompanies means-tested programs. In communities like Los Angeles, like Lawrence, where a high percentage of ridership are folks who are low income, it's worth considering those trade-offs of the administrative burden versus making the transit free. It can reduce conflict for transit operators. In Kansas City, public safety incident rates on transit vehicles dropped by 35% when zero fares were implemented. The reason? 85% of these incidents are over fare disputes. And we know that fare disputes are leading causes of safety incidents for our operators in systems across the country. Free transit can save transit systems money. It costs money, a lot of money, to collect fares. The Cape Cod RTA found that it spends 77% of the money it collects in fares paying to collect those fares. So a teeny tiny portion of their money is actually being used on service. It eliminates the potential and frankly the reality of racial profiling in fare enforcement. For example, in 2019, the Boston Globe looked at a couple of months of fare evasion on the MBTA and found that Black riders received about 42% of fare evasion citations, Latino riders accounted for another 20%, white riders less than a third. And lastly, we can implement it. In many ways, it's, I'm not talking about the financing. I have a whole laundry list. I'm ready to talk about how we pay for it. But in terms of like how you do it, you just stop collecting fares. You don't go through a procurement process. You don't have to like do a whole crazy capital thing. It's one of the few things we can do on transit that we can just like do. We can pilot, we can experiment, and that's exciting. So for me, free transit isn't a nice to have. It's a legitimate tool in the toolbox, one of many, to improve service and access to transit that should be seriously considered by transit agencies of all shapes and sizes across the country, and especially in Massachusetts. All right.
Thank you very much. Now we get into the question period. All right, so the first question, 2 parts. What data do we have that would show that free transit is actually financially possible? And how do we discuss the idea of free transit when agencies across the country struggle financially to operate current services? And that financial struggle existed pre-COVID, and it has managed to get even worse post-COVID. And we aren't seeing states respond as quickly as I imagine a lot of the transit agencies would like in trying to add assistance beyond what the federal government has done. So I don't know who wants to take this first.
Do you want me to take it, David? And then you can tell me how wrong I am.
Go for it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I feel like this is such a legitimate question. And I just like the transit staff are like incredible heroes, especially in the pandemic. Like, I don't think anyone will ever understand. We're talking about people who lost their lives. We're talking about people who stayed up around the clock to make the system run. And so, yeah, like as an advocate, I have paused and I know when I'm like upsetting people and they're like, you're literally trying to take pennies away from me. Do you understand what I'm trying to do? And so I would say the following. This is as much as I'm talking about how great it is, it doesn't happen overnight, but I think the first steps are the following. Understanding what percentage of a transit agency's budget comes from fares is a really important starting point, right? So in Kansas City, 90% of their revenue comes from a different place. So that gap, it's a lot easier for them to make the case because they can find those benefits and fill that gap more easily. CTA, MBTA, systems in New York, what we recommend is a pathway, is looking at the portions of the system that might benefit from free transit. And so that's how I say we start the conversation, is how much money are we actually collecting? Is it material? And then on the flip side, how much money are we spending, and what are the sort of pitfalls of that collection? So the hardware, the software, the staffing and operations, the enforcement, the credit card fees, the cash handling. It's worth asking those questions and seeing, is it really a substantial expense, time burden, cost burden that could be alleviated? Those are the starting points. Happy to talk about the legislative side and how we actually, I believe we have electeds on this call. There are people who are actually making movement on how we finance it, but I want to give David some space to respond.
Sure. Well, Monica, I think your question goes exactly to the point, is that this really is a trade-off. In the real political world, it really is a trade-off. And a dollar spent on defraying, on taking revenue away, to take fair revenue away, is a dollar that is not spent on expanding service. That's just the nature of the mathematics of it. I'd also say there's a very big difference between small systems and large systems. And all due respect to Lawrence, or all due respect to Olympia, Washington, neither of them is Boston or New York or Chicago. And so the fact remains that crappy service, I'll use that technical term too, is the big problem in this country. And that problem is not going to get any better by removing a significant share of transit agencies' revenue. In Kansas City, Kansas City's been mentioned, 10% of the population lives near transit that runs every 15 minutes or less, 10%. So, and the bus used to cost $1.50. So now, today, 3 years from now, it's still going to be 10% of the population in Kansas City, and the bus is going to be free. What has that done for 90% of the people who are living in transit desert with nothing? It really doesn't move the needle. It doesn't move the needle. And then the experience in places like Trenton and in Austin, elsewhere, it really has not moved the needle in terms of ridership. Nowhere in the world that has high quality transit has achieved that by anything other than adding service and responding to customers. No place has done it by simply eliminating fares. Fares are important, are part of what it takes to actually provide the service. So your question is exactly my point, that we need to be honest about that this is a trade-off, and what riders overwhelmingly say is they need more money spent on better transit.
So Stacy, talking about trade-offs, David went through several of them, and I think this is where a lot of that debate has been nationally and locally. It's like, well, if we do this, we are giving up this. So what do you think that trade-off would look like if we do make the entire system free, or even a large portion of the system free? What are we having to give up?
Yeah, so I'm gonna sort of not answer that question, answer that question. So one thing that I want to name is that we only ask poor and marginalized people to make trade-offs. That in public policy, we're frequently like, here's the thing, you either get service or it's free. And like the folks that I talk to on the ground are like, the cost of eggs and milk has gone up by 200% and I legit can't afford my bus anymore. Help me, right? Like I'm never going to talk to that person and be like, well, but let me explain to you that like you need to pay your $1.50 and we're working like for 9 months to think maybe we'll do a pilot for, low income fares and then maybe come back to you in 5 years, right? Like that doesn't fly. So I just want to say like, from a justice perspective and from the people who are most impacted, I think that starting with trade-offs is the wrong place. What I would say is there are legitimate political and financial hurdles, and then I want to start with what our goals are. And so my goal is to expand and improve transit service across the state. We need overnight service. We need weekend service. We need we need to buy buses. We need to build garages. We need to do all those things. But I've heard loud and clear from the riders that they need more accessible and potentially free fares as well. We know that that's a barrier. We know from the MIT study that it means people can't afford transit right now. And so I'd say when we're talking about trade-offs, like for whom, and let's really sit with that. But separately, I do think that the starting point is exactly what we said. So and I saw someone in the chat brought up fare collection system, which we initially were very supportive, and now we're very frustrated by. It's a very expensive fare collection system. We've been sitting in working groups for several years, and there've been a lot of questions about fare enforcement and how fares will be collected and done equitably on the bus. And at this point, we're seeing conversations about spending a lot of money to hire 80 to 100 people to enforce these fares. Spending a lot of money to try to collect money in these circumstances. And those are I think the touch points in big systems to say, would taking fare collection out of the equation produce a better result for service and produce a better result for riders? And I think that's the starting point. And I think that's a reasonable approach. It's not a trade-off. Use it as a legitimate starting point and tool to have a conversation about our shared goals of increasing service and access.
Okay, you kind of answered my question, so I'm going to take it. Kind of building off of not only what we've seen in the chat, but some of the stuff that you've said, Stacy. One of the things that keeps coming up is the cost of collecting fares and how much agencies are spending to collect fares. And so, as many agencies are doing these fare collection system overhauls, as the T is spending slightly over $1 billion to update the system. David, my question is, do you think eliminating the technology, eliminating the cost of collecting fares would over time pay for making the systems free?
To backfill a 40% revenue loss to the Chicago Transit Authority or 50% revenue loss to the MTA cannot be done with small change here and there. So I think we've got to be really clear about what problem that is that we're trying to solve. I think with regard to low-income riders, the solution that I mentioned at the very beginning addresses that and addresses it very effectively. It does not force low-income people to make the trade-off. That's not what I'm saying. Seattle, Portland, New York, multiple cities show that there is a way to provide discounts in a way that's effective, that is not stigmatizing, that anybody for whom the fare price is an obstacle can be dealt with in that way in terms of providing them access through a discount. When I talk about trade-offs, it's the decision makers on transit boards who actually have to deal with dollars and cents, who have to make those trade-offs. So they also need to manage the agency effectively and think about what it is we're trying to achieve. So in terms of the fare collection, I'm not here to defend the T on their $1 billion fare collection. I assume, I have a good sense that the T, like most American transit agencies, probably needs to do some work on its procurement processes and its capital oversight projects and could do things more effectively. To me, it's still a function that needs to happen. They may over procure, they may have problems with procuring windshield wipers. It doesn't mean they don't need windshield wipers. I think some of these other things that we want to achieve, like speed, can be achieved with all-door boarding. Equitable enforcement can be done in an unarmed, non-confrontational way. It is done in an unarmed, in San Francisco. They still have fares, but they don't have goons sticking guns in people's faces demanding the fare. So fare, again, these functions like speeding up buses and collecting fares can be done efficiently, and I think is part of fixing this in a way that solves multiple problems at once.
Can I respond very quickly on this?
Absolutely.
Look at us debate. We're doing it in real time.
Yeah, love it.
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of things. I think one, because I want to revisit this, smaller systems, like bringing up the Cape Cod example, when they're spending a huge amount of money collecting fares. That's where it's a real trade-off, right? It's a real benefit, and it could be done overnight. I was very clear that I'm not suggesting a situation where overnight the CTA loses 40% of their budget. What I'm saying is there's enough proof that experimenting with elements of free transit, free routes, actually piloting, which we are advocating strongly for in Massachusetts. There are 2 pieces of legislation that would enact, pilots that legitimately study these questions to get there is the approach, right? And so I would just agree with you that we're not saying just take the money away overnight. We would need to figure out a funding mechanism. And it's also, and I have a list of 12 different funding mechanisms, like in the same bill that the governor vetoed low income fares, he vetoed TNC fees. Right. So it's like, here's extra revenue, here's an equity measure, bye. Right. Like, we have fair share amendment, TNC fees, increasing gas tax. Fun fact, since 1991, the gas tax has been raised by 14%. In Massachusetts, bus fares are up by 300%. Like, great, like, let's reduce bus fares to what they were in 1991 and then have a fair, a conversation about this. And then there are all of these other progressive revenue, capital gains, dividend taxes, estate taxes. Like, there is an ecosystem and people are working on this. I would say I think that people who care about free transit need to be working really hard with their legislators on the revenue side, but it's not like a lost conversation. And we're not just saying we're taking the money away and we're not backfilling. Backfilling is a requirement, but there are a dozen revenue solutions in Massachusetts alone.
Thank you. So kind of building a little bit off of some of the stuff that you've been talking about, Stacy, when we talk about statewide legislation, we have 15 regional transit authorities here in Massachusetts. Many other states have many more than that. When we're talking about making public transit free, are we just talking about larger agencies, or are we talking about agencies across the state? And I'm going to talk specifically about Massachusetts because this is one of the areas that you talked about, Stacy. And then David, I don't know if you want to add something from a national level after that, but Stacy, if you'd like to go first.
Yeah, so I'm going to start a few things. I have a soft spot in my heart for the regional transit authorities. Like, we just need to give them more money. They need to run more service. They are heroes. They're like the coolest systems. Worcester is just like, I love it. And what we've seen is that free transit actually seems to work better or sort of click faster in these smaller systems that are just buses, maybe a little light rail combined. It doesn't, we need much more statewide transit. People don't get, like, we have transit in rural areas. It's like amazing transit that really serves people. And it's typically low income folks where it's just like, for these smaller agencies, implementing means tested programs on top of fare collection, it just sort of like wipes out that fare revenue to begin with. So I actually think it's easier, and our leaders, our champions, our innovators are out in those rural areas, really rocking the free transit conversation.
Thank you. David, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just reiterate again, small town systems are fundamentally just very different from large urban areas.
All right, I'm going to ask two final questions. They're fairly difficult, so prepare yourselves. And then we're going to go ahead and open it up for the audience Q&A. I'm going to start with you, David, first. Given your arguments today, given all the points that you've made and the stance that you've made, what would it take to change your mind? What would it take for you to be in support of free public transit?
If this were a country where there were unlimited funds and where I didn't have the concern that we are misprioritizing fares relative to the other things that money is really needed for Nancy Wilkins, who I was just describing, who needs better transportation. If we lived in a world where money was unlimited and we weren't having to make the trade-offs that in fact we really honestly do have to make in public life, then I think it'd be great.
Stacy, how about you? What would it take to bring you over to the other side?
Well, I'm way easier than David, because what it would take for me is 12-month statewide free buses pilot in Massachusetts that collects the data and proves me wrong. Right? I feel like I walked into this conversation with a bunch of data points that have my back, and we're in a moment where we have federal funds, we're not collecting enough fares, and so the pilot will show us, right? We can do it on a big system, we can do it on some small systems, we can ask good data-driven questions. That is what will convince me if we actually try some of these things and see if they work. And if they don't, well then, I can be moved.
Actually building a little off of that, I'm a huge fan of pilots. I love pilots. I love testing things. But the places that I feel like agencies kind of trip up is, what does success look like? How do we measure that success? If we were to do a 12-month pilot, what does success look like at the end? What measurements, what data would we need to understand to say, yes, this is successful, this is something that we should make permanent?
Yep. So I think, wait, do you want David to respond? Me, doesn't matter.
You first, Stacy, and then if David would like to add on.
So I think that it should be a different measure for large and small systems. And I think the things that I care about are, what were the service improvements? Like, were there meaningful service improvements? Was there an increase in ridership? And I would like to see additional data on what kind of riders, right? I actually don't think that free transit is going to move car drivers necessarily, but if it brings more people who had an actual cost burden, that's a really important learning for us to consider. And I would also say some of these other externalities around how much I would like to see a measurable cost reduction on like how much money was saved in the agency by not collecting fares. Bus driver experience, was it easier to do their job, and what is that cost saving over time? And the last thing, we have to talk about the experience of Black and brown folks on our buses, particularly in our urban settings. The point about you brought up sort of armed enforcement. The statistics I used were those tickets didn't come with guns. These people were just targeted and got citations because of the color of their skin. And so I think we have to have equity measures as well around what are the co-benefits, particularly in our communities of color. So all of those things, it's not just about the money and the service. I think we have to talk about the other experiences as well.
Okay, David?
Yeah, that's actually, I love that question. It's actually an easy one. It sets me up very well to promote a measurement tool that we are still tweaking some of the Boston figures on, but we have a national model out describing sort of the concept on our website, Transit Equity Dashboard, that really, for the first time, measures how far people can get, accessing not just jobs, but access to groceries, access to doctor's appointments, and doing that by race, by income. It can be portrayed in a lot of different ways. And price is one component. I totally agree that price is a component, and I've suggested a way that should be addressed for the people for whom it is a most critical component. Price is one component. And in fact, the price in terms of your area, and in terms of Jared Johnson's dream about regional rail, that includes changing the disparities in rail fares because they're totally out of whack, right? And our tool takes that into account in terms of a $5 threshold. So I would want to see how has equitable access been changed by an experiment. I would also want to see, well, what were the alternative, what were the opportunity costs, what were the foregone service expansions that couldn't be done because of the revenue shortfall, and measure what that would have done for somebody like Nancy Wilkins relative to giving her a transit pass.
Thank you.
In other words, if she's still spending an hour and 43 minutes and she's actually likely to have to go buy a car, if her attitude toward, well, you've given me a free, my first year in Boston was 70. Anybody remember the 78, 79 Celtics? They were terrible. I had friends who were basketball players and they said, I wouldn't go if the ticket were free, right? And that's how a lot of potential transit riders are, frankly, about US transit. I wouldn't go even if the ticket were free. So if people like Nancy Wilkins aren't being helped by giving a free ticket to a really substandard product, I'd want to know that.
I feel like I could just ask questions all day. I love talking to the two of you, but I am going to.
I feel like MBTA staff and you're up on the dais asking to see my audited numbers. Love it.
You know me, I'm all about the data.
Yeah.
Catherine, I don't know if you want to start the audience questions, and because I think we have about 20 minutes left, and I've seen a lot come through the Q&A in the chat. A lot of them have been answered by our two panelists as we've been going through this debate. So if we don't get to all of them, we did already unintentionally get to several of them. So Catherine, I don't know if you want to go ahead and pick one.
Yeah, absolutely. I was about to say I have the unenviable task of trying to curate some of these, but the benefit is that some have already been answered. I think there are two there are two big things that I see coming up in a couple of questions. One is really does free transit solve the equity issue effectively? What and why shouldn't equity be a main policy goal? So I think maybe that's the first one.
Okay, free transit does not solve the equity issue because we have like hundreds of years of like racism and disparities and like many decades of service decisions that disparately impact communities of color and low-income communities. So does free transit solve the equity problem? Like, no. Can free transit contribute to the march we need to make over the coming years to make the communities that we've disenfranchised whole? Yes. And so I think that is the approach to take, right? We put out a report with TransitCenter, with the support of TransitCenter, the 64 hours report that showed that on average, Black riders spend 64 more hours than their white counterparts on the bus every year in Massachusetts. And our recommendations in that report were primarily around running more bus service and building more bus facilities. So I want to be clear that free transit is not a panacea. But I do think when we're talking about the intersection of enforcement and when we're talking about low-income populations, it has a real impact, especially when we talk about the added burden of forcing low-income folks to move into to means-tested programs, which the Rappaport Institute has been doing great work on food insecurity. And SNAP did not keep people fed during the pandemic. It was a real crisis. So I think we have a lot, in the same way you can say we don't know how to fund free transit, we don't know how to feed people in this country either. I'll stop.
David, I think you want to add?
Sure. I think in terms of the price barriers, inequitable price barriers, the most effective step that can be taken toward equity is to target those benefits to those who need them most, rather than giving them to a lot of people who don't need them. So the stockbroker who's coming from Wellesley Farms into a $300,000 a year job at the Pru really doesn't need free transit. The threat actually is that by undermining the revenue of the transit agency and therefore the service, it could potentially not only be neutral toward equity, it could actually be detrimental in terms of reducing the access that people have because of the service. Could also be harmful for the workforce. The transit frontline workforce is predominantly people of color. I don't know if that's the case in Boston, but it's the case in much of the country. And anything that decreases the fiscal resources to transit agencies is a threat to them as well. So I think in terms of overall equity, you have to look both at the service as well as the price.
Thank you. I'm actually going to intercede a little bit because I have been reading so much about these debates. They're in my friend group chat. My mom's got opinions. People have opinions in the chat here. David, one of the things that I've heard you say and a lot of other people say is this shouldn't be a debate because it isn't anything that riders are asking for. And so this is something I've heard from multiple people. And so I want to make sure that I am kind of reflecting what you've said correctly in that. But if it isn't something that riders are predominantly asking for, then why has this become such a debate more recently? Because this isn't a debate we've been having over the last several years. It really is a more recent debate.
Just in terms of sort of riders' opinions, we're informed by our surveys. It's not our opinion. It's not something we've put into anybody else's head. It's what we've gone out and asked. We have a series of reports every few years called Who's on Board? And so those are just generated from a scientific sample of what matters to riders. And as I said, they invariably rank service, the availability of the service, before they rank fair price as being an obstacle for them. And for those who do rank it, there's a way to address that. I guess, so therefore, if it's not coming from the lived experience or request of riders, why is it? I think maybe, and this is cynical, but I think accurate, is that it's an attractive soundbite, and that it's easy if you're the mayor of Kansas City, then rather than doing the really tough work that the mayor of Kansas City should be doing to actually improve transit, and so that you have 20% of your city living near frequent transit rather than 10% today. It's easier to say, oh, well, we're eliminating the fare. I'm really green. I'm really, and then go on to the next press conference without regard to that for 90% of your city, you have really done nothing, because doing the tough stuff is actually tough, growing the service. So I think it sounds on the surface, free transit, who can be against it? Sounds great. And again, I said, in an ideal world, I think it would be great. But I think that's where some of the momentum comes from, frankly.
Do I get to answer this question too?
Yes, please.
Yeah, no, it's funny because I actually have a sort of a different take. And so to be clear, LivableStreets, while we took a free buses approach about 1.5 years ago and people thought we were crazy, we're like, this math seems good. We're just going to say it out loud. We're going to say it. It's going to be that way. We had nothing in our work plan as an organization to work on free transit, but the call from the people that we work with was so strong that we pivoted to respond to that call. And so it's not this, from my perspective, it's like when we ask these, it depends on how you ask the questions and what answers you are seeking. And so it really matters. I mean, I think that we're seeing this transformation, one, because a lot of people did, like the MBTA buses, we had rear door boarding for a while and people had the experience of not paying. That really triggered some real world experiences. And I can't, there were two worlds in the pandemic. Like I get really frustrated when people are like, look at all the open streets and it was so great and we all worked from home, because like when we're talking about bus riders, they rode those buses every day. They lived in a different world. They're still struggling to feed their families. They're going to spend the next decade recovering from what happened to them if they're even in their homes. And so for us, the conversation at the deepest level has really been coming from a need and from a lived experience that says that $1.50 matters in my ability to feed my children today. So I don't think it's a fluke. I do think that the larger narrative of wealth stratification and real need is contributing to what's happening. And I would say, I also don't think it's overnight, like real talk, we are talking about free buses in the MBTA. We're also strong advocates of means tested fares, because we can't just offer free buses and not make the rest of the system whole, because the need is so great. And we recognize that there's a bridge to get there. But the need is tremendous. And I think anyone who's really doing frontline work is experiencing that right now.
Thank you. Sorry for it was something that I just was thinking about, like, this is probably a good question. I know that we're getting short on time. Catherine, do we maybe have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions from the audience?
Yes, and again, apologies to anyone who there's so much great out here on the chat and Q&A. So for all of you watching, please take a look and read what people are putting in. I think there are kind of 2 things that are still coming up in multiple questions. One is a question about mode shift, which was touched on quickly, but one person writes, given the climate emergency we are in, shouldn't we be doing whatever we can to get people out of cars and into buses and bikes? And therefore, does free transit help do that? So maybe we can talk about any data you guys may have on that.
Yes. I would point you to all of the statistics that I showed that free transit increases ridership in these smaller systems. But David, I know you have opinions on this. I'm going to bat this one to you.
No, I don't have opinions. I just have examples of places that have tried it. And the answer is no. Tallinn, Estonia, which actually combined free transit with very strict limits on automobiles and higher parking fees, really, it did not mode shift. The experiments done in Trenton, New Jersey, in Austin, Texas, really, I think, validate again that it is not the fare price that is the major issue that is inhibiting transit ridership in this country, or others. And every other industrialized country in the world has better transit than the United States does. And the way they have achieved that is the tried and true fundamental way of providing really abundant, good transit. And then subsidizing the fare, which is in part paid for by fares, just like paying our water bill pays for the water pipes, just like paying our electric bill pays for the electricity wires. and allows us to have those services with discounts for those who need them as part of our social safety net and poverty alleviation. So the only thing that will get more ridership on transit to the scale we need for the climate emergency is far, far more transit. That is the only thing, more frequent, more hours of the day, 7 days a week, convenience, safety. Those are the only things that have been proven to actually shift people to transit to the degree that we need them to.
I mean, I have two quick responses on the climate front. So one, I would just say, I think that the timing of the pilots or the examples is really important. I very purposefully only picked examples from the last 2 years because I think the context of the moment that we live in is different. Like the Estonia example is brought up a million times, but how many pilots have happened since Estonia? So I think understanding the political and socioeconomic dynamics is important. And then on the climate front, I don't think any one transit solution is gonna solve the problem. GHG emissions are the largest portion of emissions in the state. I would look to Joe Boncory's Transportation New Deal, which is a potpourri of like, here are several revenue sources we need to deal with. Here's how we're gonna talk about congestion pricing. Here's how we're gonna improve transit service. Like if we wanna get real about climate change, let's have that conversation next, Catherine, about the like real package of solutions that like, if you want to get spicy, talk about congestion pricing. Free buses is easy.
That was on the list, Stacy. That might be in the 2022 Greater Boston Debate Series. So stay tuned for that. I'm going to ask one final that I'm going to try to wrap into like 5 questions that are slightly overlapping from the audience. Let's see if I can do that effectively. And you guys are going to get basically like a minute and a half each to answer. So is there any reason to not make transit free other than the funding gap? And the follow-on that brings into a lot of these questions is, if there isn't, shouldn't we just tax road sales tax, use some other congestion pricing? Shouldn't we find those ways to fund that gap, politics aside, which then will bring in the final part of this question, which comes from a political science public policy professor saying that, do we actually get a long-term political benefit of funding transit better if we can induce ridership with free transit? So did you get all of that? Can you somehow answer? I guess the main question is there any reason other than the funding gap to not do this? And if you can touch on dealing with some of those politics, that would be great. David, I guess maybe you should kick it off with any reason other than the funding gap.
Yeah, well, the framing of the question is, well, you know, if we could get all this other money from the State House, politics aside, you know, that was your politics aside. Well, again, that's not a luxury that transit managers who are trying to make a budget and put service out on the street can afford to say, well, politics aside. I mean, there are a lot of great theoretical revenue sources, but actually achieving them is tough. And I think one of the ways that you achieve political support is by having a good product that people actually want to support. They don't want to just sort of bail out the existing bad system and have a bad system that is just the same old bad system, but now doesn't charge fares. So I guess the answer to what I think was your question, is there a reason not to do it other than the financial trade-off? I can't think of any. I mean, to me, it is a matter of priorities and dollars and cents. That free transit would be fantastic. So would free electricity. So would a lot of things. But I guess I'm just pointing out the facts that budgets are actually finite and that we need to prioritize the things that riders need most, which is good transit, and fares are a component of paying for that.
Yeah, like horrible free things like schools and healthcare. Yeah, no. I mean, I want to answer this question because I think the politics aside thing is not the approach. For me, it's politics full steam ahead. Like if anyone is watching this today and is like, yes, I want to do free fares, then y'all need to get on the bandwagon because we have work to do. I am a relentless optimist, but we are busy. and I actually think that the answer is like, okay, if funding is the problem and it's about service too, then we actually need to be operating really aggressively at the federal level and the state level right now. David, knows this, and there are many groups that are helping mobilize transit advocates across the country to convince the federal government to pay for operating funds, which we have not been doing ever. And that is part of this conversation. Ayanna Presley has put forward the Freedom to Move Act, which is a grant program designed to do this work. At the State House, there are several revenue bills. There's the Public Transit Public Good Coalition, the Transit is Essential Coalition. Like, this is an active conversation that is actively moving. And so the question isn't like, is this a good idea, or is it a good reason? It's like, are you ready for transit to be a public good, and how hard are you willing to fight for it? So.
All right, I think that is it. Stacy, David, thank you so much. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with either of you in which I did not walk away with a whole boatload of new things to think about, but you both nailed it. Our communities are suffering right now. They were suffering pre-COVID, they're definitely suffering now. And I think transit is always going to be vital to the health of our communities. And I think both of you may have not agreed on the free transit part, but I think you did both agree that we have to start thinking about better, more progressive ways to fund our transit systems. I'm looking at the people who are in the audience, and I think some of you have direct impact on that. So I hope that you really understand that this is a call. This is a call for better ways to approach the financial issues that our agencies are facing. But I do want to thank both of you. I want to thank the Rappaport Institute for setting up this wonderful debate series. I feel like we've already put together further debates that'll take us into probably 2023. But I also urge everyone, please check out the organizations, LivableStreets, TransitCenter. Both of them have fantastic information on their sites. TransitCenter has an entire repository of wonderful examples around a number of different transportation issues. And Stacy had pointed out a number of organizations locally. So please, please, please check out those organizations. Continue to support the Rappaport Institute. And I really, really do appreciate being able to be part of this discussion this evening. Catherine?
Well, I thank the three of you so much for agreeing to this. The idea, I think when my colleague Lissy Medvedow over at the Rappaport Center and I and our colleagues Polly and Cindy were first talking about that, it was, we really want the time and the space for some people who are steeped in the data and this issue to be able to go back and forth. And it was amazing to experience that with you today. And again, yes, this is the beginning of what we hope between the Rappaport Institute and Rappaport Center will be a continuing, ongoing Greater Boston Debate Series. So you can join us again. We're going to take a summer hiatus and we'll be back in late September to talk about rent control in some form or another. That's a really clearly an easy one. That it'll be a simple conversation. And in fact, if you have anyone that you think might be a great panelist for that, please be in touch with us. And we'll continue on and we'll take suggestions for further topics. And Stacy and David, you may be on the same side as congestion pricing. I don't know. So maybe we'll bring that one up next year, and we have to find the con side of that. But until then, thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all.
And we look forward to seeing you in September. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Great.
Take care.
Thank you. Polly, are we